1 week after two devastating earthquakes struck Turkey and Syria, the reported death toll reached 33,000 on Sunday. Hopeful moments of rescuers pulling people alive from the rubble are now happening less and less. A top UN official is predicting the number of dead could reach more than 50,000. Many survivors have no shelter at all. Aid is reaching Turkey, but the UN has said that more is desperately needed for the regions of Syria, where relief has been slow to arrive. And there is growing despair at the massive ongoing humanitarian crisis. Our correspondent Julia Hahn is in Turkey's hard-hit Hatay province and brought us this report from the town of Iskenderun.
This is what's left of the state hospital in the city of Iskenderun. Built to save lives, it became a death trap. The building collapsed on patients after the earthquake struck. 1 week later, rescue teams are still digging through the rubble, searching for survivors.
Can you give us any information about the person you have found? No, we couldn't find any ID.
Mesa Kaya listens anxiously whenever the rescuers announce they found someone. Her grandmother was at the hospital when the quake hit. Mesa hasn't slept for days. She's been sitting here waiting, feeling helpless. I don't know how many days have passed. I lost track of time. They only started looking for her now. We are waiting here for her. I love my grandma very much. My second name is Aysel. I was named after her. Mesa's cousin Alican says mismanagement by the local authorities contributed to the disaster. He shows me what the hospital looked like before it collapsed. The building was dilapidated for years, he says. Unsafe, but no one did anything about it.
It was obvious that this building would collapse sooner or later, even without an earthquake. But why have they kept using it until it became a tomb for everyone inside?
The scale of the destruction is overwhelming. Across the region, thousands of buildings have collapsed. Entire neighborhoods have been flattened, and hundreds of thousands of people left homeless. We meet some of them in this makeshift camp in Iskenderun. It feels disorganized, desperate. Families who were strangers a week ago are now forced to share a small tent with not much in it. We don't have enough tents. It's so cold inside, it doesn't warm up. I have 2 kids. We only have a stove. We are sharing 1 tent with 2 other families. It's been raining. The kids are all sick and I have a small baby. Please, for God's sake, send us a tent. No help has come here at all. Mete Buhara is a local governor. He's been sent here to lead the crisis response in the area. 90% of his team are volunteers. Buhara admits that the country's disaster response was too slow in the first days. But now, he says, everyone's pulling in the same direction.
We experienced a very big tragedy. It's absolutely normal for those who are experiencing such a tragedy to feel down and to complain. Surely we have lessons to learn, outcomes to examine. But from this point forward, we will try to see this as a chance to start over. We will try our best to emerge from this better.
At the ruins of Iskenderun's hospital, Mesa isn't ready to start over yet. She'll be waiting for news about her grandma for as long as it takes. And she knows that things may get worse before they get better.
Well, for more on that, let's bring in Arwa Damon, the founder and president of the International Network for Aid, Relief and Assistance. She joins us from Adana in Turkey. Now, you arrived there yesterday. What is your impression of the situation a week after the quake has struck?
It's the sort of situation that still, even though, as you mentioned there, it has been a week since the earthquake struck, is very difficult for anyone who experienced it and those of us who are coming and trying to respond to it to really, truly comprehend. Look, I was a war correspondent with CNN for 17 years. A lot of people have compared this to a war zone. From my perspective, this is not a war zone. This is something else entirely. The sheer level of destruction that happened over the sheer expanse of space that it happened over is not anything that anyone, any organization in recent memory has had to cope with. And the situation on the ground is growing increasingly desperate for those who are waiting for any kind of news from their loved ones, and for those of us who are trying to respond to the overwhelming needs that exist. We're talking about millions of people at the same time who had their lives upended. And we've been going out into the field trying to reach the children that we used to work with, trying to reach other families, doing very specific targeted humanitarian distributions. And you see this sort of shock on people's faces. And it's almost as if their expressions have been frozen in time. There is a sort of silence to the way that their faces would have normally expressed emotion. And right now, it's shock, it's trauma, it's sorrow, it's anguish, and then it's confusion. I mean, where does this country go from here? Where does this region go from here?
Now, do you think, in light of this unprecedented event, really, in terms of scale, is the international community doing enough?
In a nutshell, no, I would have to say. You do have a significant and very heartwarming flood and outpouring of support for Turkey. We have seen international crews from all over the world sending in their rescue teams. We've seen aid coming into Turkey from land, from sea, from air. Turkey's response has been quite innovative in some cases. They've transformed ferries into moving hospitals. They've put universities in-person education on hold, and they are using university space as dormitories. But that's on the Turkish side of the border. Let's talk about what's happened inside northwestern Syria. You do not see any of that. The UN has barely been able to get a few trucks across that border. Getting aid into that area is so bogged down in politics, it's almost despicable. And all that being said and done, though, despite this outpouring of aid that we're seeing into Turkey, because of the sheer scale of it, it's not enough. Look, I was out in the field all day yesterday. We have teams here. There are countless families who are not receiving the aid that they need, and that's inside Turkey. Again, in northwestern Syria, everything is needed. Everyone needs everything. But even here, you have families who are unable to access distribution points. You have people scattered over an area that is so vast that aid is not reaching them. And then you have specifically what we at INARA are focusing on, which is targeted distributions to these families that either are not accessing aid or that have very specific needs. And then there's things that aren't generally in aid baskets. We're talking about, clean undergarments. We're talking about battery packs and flashlights because power keeps out and everyone wants to be able to stay in touch with their loved ones. And let me just go back to northwestern Syria for a moment. There a lack of assistance, a lack of heavy machinery, a lack of diesel to run the heavy machinery that was inside the country, a lack of humanitarian assistance, being able to cross across the border. That is killing people.
Our Damon there in Adana. Thank you very much. Now, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been facing growing criticism over his response to the earthquake disaster. It comes at a time when he's gearing up for a re-election campaign. But now doubts are being cast on whether the vote will even take place as expected in May. More on that in a moment, but first this report.
Recep Tayyip Erdogan has dominated Turkey for 20 years, first as prime minister, then as president with increased powers. Erdogan was already facing a tough re-election campaign, with his approval rating sagging over his handling of the country's economy. Now he's also being criticized over the government's response to the earthquake disaster. Erdogan has admitted that the initial rescue effort was too slow.
Certainly there were shortcomings, that is clear. It is impossible to be prepared to deal with a disaster like this.
But Turkey is no stranger to earthquakes. After the 1999 disaster that killed more than 17,000 people, the government implemented what's known as the earthquake tax to bolster emergency services. But how the more than 4 billion euros has actually been spent has never been made public. While Erdogan was visiting the disaster zone after last week's quake, Turkish authorities restricted access to Twitter for several hours, allegedly to stop disinformation. Opposition leaders said the move threatened to hinder volunteer rescue and humanitarian work. Erdogan lashed out at what he called dishonest people, who he said were trying to use the crisis for political gain.
Right now is the time for unity. It is a time for solidarity. In times like these, it is not appropriate to take part in negative campaigning solely to serve political interests.
The opposition newspaper Cumhuriyet has pointed out that the 1999 earthquake ushered in a new era in Turkish politics and said the 2023 disaster could do the same.
I'm now joined in the studio by Erkan Erkan. He's the head of DW's Turkish service. Erkan, thanks for joining us here in the studio. Now, Erdogan and his government are facing a lot of criticism over this emergency response right now. Can you give us more details?
Gerd, past week I was in Ankara talking to some opposition politicians, and they say that the government reacted too slow. They sent it too slow. Heavy machines, accelerators, and so on, just to help the people, because the whole situation, because of the rescue missions, turned out to a mission to put out the dead bodies out of the rubble. So therefore, the time was the major impact in the whole situation. And as I said, the politician said, Erdogan reacts too slow, and he showed up at the earthquake area just 48 hours later, and this is plenty too slow and too late.
So, do you reckon this will have an impact on the upcoming elections?
Well, frankly, the elections, Erdogan said something about May the 14th, but it wasn't sure yet because the election committee has to approve this date. They haven't. So it can be that the original date of June the 18th will be focused right now. But I'm not sure whether they can make it on June, because it seems, as I said, the opposition makers, which I talked last week, they say Erdogan could use this to postpone or to delay the elections till September. Everything is possible. There is a proverb in Turkey, you never know in 24 hours what happened in Turkey. You mightn't even know what happened in the next 3 months in Turkey.
Now, do you think, given that he's been in power in a variety of functions for so long, more than 20 years, is it justified to point with a finger at him and look for responsibility there?
Unfortunately, yes. From the earthquake in 1999, the lessons weren't learned. Even in valleys, they build up a lot of houses and hospitals, for example, and even the hospitals, government builds buildings, you know, are not that safe like private buildings. And this is something that I said lessons weren't learned. They had to be more secure and had to be more protected through the earthquakes. And that wasn't very good right now. So therefore, unfortunately, I have to say yes. Erdogan has to face a lot of more criticism in the future.
Now, you mentioned that these buildings, or many buildings, should have been built in a more structurally sound way. Is this going to happen after this, you think?
It's a very tough question. I have to say I don't think so, because the corruption is one of the major impacts in Turkish politics. And we have to see and we have to wait what kind of finish we're going to see in the elections. And probably the next president will do something more for this kind of incidents.
Erkan Arakan, the head of DW's Turkish service there, thank you for joining us here in the studio.